A skeleton hidden in a canyon wall for 13,000 years is forcing history to admit the first Americans may have arrived by sea. 1959 Arlington Canyon, Santa Rosa Island, California. A jeep is stuck in the mud, and while the crew fights to free it, one man suddenly looks up at the canyon. 37 feet down, a human bone is sticking straight out of solid earth. Will become one of the oldest human skeletons ever found in North America. But there is a problem nobody expected. This island was never connected to the mainland. Whoever this was did not walk here. They came by boat thousands of years before the first Americans were supposed to have boats. That is where this gets strange. The man's name was Phil, or curator of anthropology and paleontology at the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History. He had been walking these canyons for over a decade, and he knew right away that this was not driftwood, not an animal bone, not something to photograph and forget. It got funding, brought in a small crew, and in 1960 they cut a whole block of earth out of the canyon wall, sediment, bone and all, and sealed it in plaster, like a fossil ready for shipping. Inside that plaster jacket were two fragile human leg bones and one small piece nobody could even identify, or called it a man. He published his findings in Science in American Antiquity and in his own book on the island's prehistory. For a while it looked like the story was finished. A body, an age, a place in the history books. Then the block went into the museum basement and stayed there. Not for a few years, for 27 years. Untouched, unopened, sitting on a shelf while a whole scientific field kept arguing about who really got to America first and how that happened. That should bother you. If this really was one of the oldest human skeletons in North America, why did nobody rush to confirm it? The honest answer is not a cover-up. It is stranger than that. A mix of bad timing, poor funding, and a first-generation radiocarbon date that nobody fully trusted. To understand why, you have to go back to what or actually had to work. Within 1960, radiocarbon dating was still new and or did not have a way to date the bone itself. He dated charcoal found near it. Instead, a piece touching the bone gave one number. A piece 1 foot away gave another. Both numbers landed somewhere around 10,000 years old. Give or take a margin so wide it could swallow whole centuries. Or believed it. Not everyone else did. Charcoal is not bone. It can wash in from a different time, sit next to something much older or much younger, and still look connected. The date was suggestive. It was not proof. And there was another problem. One that mattered more than anyone realized at the time. The bones themselves had not been found where they died. Geologists later confirmed the canyon had been carved and refilled by an ancient stream, which meant the body had been disturbed, moved, and reburied by nature itself long before or ever arrived. Whatever was next to those bones in the sediment might not be the same age as the bones at all. So the block sat in storage, half forgotten, its real age still unclear, until two researchers, Don Morris of Channel Islands National Park and John Johnson of the Santa Barbara Museum, found it again in May of 1987. They knew exactly what they were looking. They also knew the technology to finally answer the question had only just become available. Accelerator mass spectrometry, a method that could date a sample using almost nothing. A few milligrams of actual bone collagen, not a chunk of nearby charcoal. They sent a fragment for testing. The result came back useless. Not old, not young, undateable. The bone had lost almost all of its nitrogen. The protein signal scientists rely on had broken down, and whatever carbon remained was too contaminated by minerals from the soil to trust. 27 years of waiting, and the first real attempt to date the skeleton properly had failed completely. And it got worse before it got better. When they finally excavated what remained inside that plaster block, there was not much left to work with. Two femurs, one small unidentified bone fragment. That was it. No skull, no pelvis, no ribs, no vertebrae, no hands. Whatever else had once been part of this body was gone, worn away by the same stream that reburied it thousands of years before Phil ever set foot in that canyon. 6 more excavation seasons over the next 2 decades turned up small stone flakes from ancient tool making. They never found another human bone. That absence created a second, quieter mystery. Without a skull or a pelvis, the parts of a skeleton scientists usually use to determine sex, nobody could say for sure whether this was a man or a woman, or had called it a man in 1959, based on nothing more than the general size of the bone. In 2002, a closer study of the surviving femur's shape and measurements pointed toward a woman instead. For a while, the skeleton was even called Arlington Springs woman. In 2006, another look at the bone's thickness swung the identification back toward probably male. 3 different answers from 3 different decades on the same 2 bones. Even now, nobody can settle. That is not a cover-up. That is what happens when almost the whole body is missing and all that is left is a shape and bone that can be read 2 ways. The undateable result was not the end of the story. It was the reason for a better one. Radiocarbon specialist Thomas Stafford took on the bone next, using a purification method that stripped out the contamination the first test could not handle. A chemical resin called XAD designed to isolate only the true collagen locked inside the bone and wash away everything the soil had added. Over 13,000 years underground. It is slow, exact work. You are not just measuring decay anymore. You are separating what the bone really is from everything it picked up while buried. The first results were inconsistent. 1 fraction of the bone dated to just over 6,000 years. Another 2 were closer to 9,000. That kind of spread should worry you, and it worried the researchers too. But the best preserved sample, the one least touched by contamination, gave a very different number: 10,960 radiocarbon years plus or minus 80. Calibrated to calendar time, that is, roughly 13,000 years old. Not an estimate built on nearby charcoal. Number pulled directly from the collagen inside the person's own leg bone. Researchers did not stop there. In the same layer of sediment, they found the jawbone of an extinct deer mouse species that vanished from the island long ago. They dated that to 11,490 years. Different species, same sediment, same general window of time. It was not proof the 2 were buried on the exact same day. Remember, this ground had been reworked by an ancient stream, but it placed the human bone inside a very specific, very old slice of history that nobody could easily dismiss. Here is where the story stops being about one skeleton and starts being about the whole model of how humans reached North America. Santa Rosa Island, along with its neighbors, was never connected to the mainland by a land bridge or an ice-free corridor. At the end of the last ice age, when sea levels were lower, its northern islands merged into a single, larger landmass researchers call Santa Rosa. But even then, a channel of open water separated it from the coast. There is no version of the story where someone walked there. Whoever this was, 13,000 years ago, arrived by boat. The single fact undercuts the version of history most people were taught. The main model for decades, often called Clovis first, held that the earliest Americans crossed from Siberia into Alaska and walked south through an interior corridor as the ice retreated, spreading out as big game hunters. Roughly 13,000 years ago. Coastal migration, the idea that people moved south by boat hugging the shoreline instead of the interior, was treated for years as a fringe idea, mostly because the coastline they would have traveled is now under more than 300 feet of ocean, drowned by the same melting ice that opened the interior route. You cannot easily excavate a shoreline that has been underwater for 10,000 years. Arlington Springs is one of the only places where that missing coastal evidence actually appears, literally out of an eroding canyon wall. And it does not stand alone. On nearby San Miguel Island, Daisy Cave preserves confirmed evidence of maritime life going back more than 10,000 years, with older deposits reaching even farther. Across the Channel Islands, archaeologists have found finely made stemmed spear points and small crescent-shaped tools dated to roughly 12,000 years ago. And not one single Clovis-style fluted point has ever turned up on these islands. Different toolkit, different technique, possibly a different cultural tradition entirely. One built around boats and shellfish in open water, instead of mammoth herds on open plains. Which brings up the mammoths anyway, because the islands had their own dwarf species that had shrunk to survive on limited land, and a nearly complete pygmy mammoth skeleton was found not far away, dated to around 12,800 years ago. Same window, same island. It is tempting to connect the dots. Early islanders hunting a miniature giant into extinction. The National Park Service is blunt about. There is no conclusive evidence anyone ever hunted these mammoths. It is a theory, not a finding. But the timing alone is the kind of detail that keeps researchers up at night. You would think a date like this would come with DNA to back it up, a clean genetic thread connecting this person to a known population the way modern investigations usually work. It does not. The bone had degraded too badly. No usable DNA ever came out of it, and none ever will now. But DNA has answered this exact question elsewhere, and it is worth knowing what it found. An infant buried in Montana around 12,800 years ago, the only human skeleton ever directly linked to Clovis culture, had his full genome sequenced in 2014. His ancestry traces directly to modern Native American populations, especially those in Central and South America. And his mitochondrial DNA carries a lineage tied to coastal migration. A separate skeleton found in Washington state and fought over in court for 20 years before finally being tested turned out to be more closely related to living Native Americans than to any other population on Earth. Two different bodies, two different fights. Same conclusion. The people who left these bones behind are not a mystery outside history. They are ancestors. So what happened to the actual bones? The two femurs and that one unidentified fragment that started all of this? In April of 2022, the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History repatriated them along with other Chumash remains and funerary items to the Santa Ynez Band of Chumash Mission Indians under federal repatriation law. The museum's president called it deeply satisfying to finally return what they had cared for. The tribal chairman called it coming home. The remains are set for reburial according to tradition, which means the file on the skeleton is now permanently closed. No new scan, no new test, no revisiting the sex debate, the exact age, or anything else. Whatever science knows about Arlington Springs, it knows for good. Frozen at the last analysis anyone will ever be allowed to run. That closure creates real tension. For decades, scientists treated skeletal remains like data, numbers to pull out, tests to run, papers to publish. Federal law now says otherwise. Human remains belong first to descendant communities, not to institutions, and no amount of unanswered scientific curiosity outweighs that. Some researchers quietly wish they had another decade of access. Nobody with any sense argues the bones should have stayed on a shelf. There is a deeper continuity in that decision that the label on a museum case never quite captures. John Johnson, the researcher who helped date these bones, has said it plainly. People showed up on this island roughly 13,000 years ago and evolved over time into the people we know today as the Chumash, a maritime culture built entirely around canoes, open water, and the sea. The skeleton in that canyon wall is not a dead end in the historical record. Might be the beginning of a line that never actually broke, and the canyon itself has not stopped moving. The same erosion that exposed the skeleton in 1959 is still active today, still cutting into the bluffs and arroyos across Santa Rosa and the other Channel Islands. Researchers have mapped thousands of archaeological sites along this coastline: shell middens, ancient house pits, tool scatters, and warned in blunt terms that rising seas and retreating cliffs are putting a huge share of them at risk. Nobody is stationed at every eroding bluff with a camera and a trowel. Most of what washes out will simply wash away unnoticed, unrecorded, gone before anyone realizes what it was. That is the part of the story that should really unsettle you. Arlington Springs was not found because science went looking for it. It was found because a jeep got stuck in the mud and a man happened to look up at exactly the wrong or exactly the right moment. The evidence had already survived 13,000 years underground. Almost did not survive one accident of timing. Somewhere out there right now, another canyon wall on another island is quietly falling apart. Another sliver of bone, another fragment of tool, another piece of a story nobody has told yet is easing out of the sediment a little farther. With every storm it might wash into the Pacific next winter. It might sit exposed for another decade before anyone looks up and notices. The bones that rewrote the story of the first Americans are back in the ground. Now, this time for good, resting under a canyon wall that is still quietly coming apart.